This week we begin the Rambam's Shemonah Perakim, and particularly his introduction. And he says, he just makes a couple statements that I really want to focus on. He says like this. He explains the reasoning for him writing this. He says, "Shekavanati hatoelet lakoreh ulvayer lo ha'inyanim hagnuzim bezot ha'masechta." Rambam says his purpose in writing this is to help us glean the hidden messages in Masechet Avot. And this is important because he says, although the contents of the treatise seem clear and easy to understand, yet to carry out all that it contains is not a simple matter for everybody. And this is an important point, because often, we'll take these statements by Chazal, and particularly Pirkei Avot, and we'll be like, oh, that's some nice advice, but they really need to be unpacked. And Rav Bernstein deals with this in his work, The Call of Sinai, on page 64. So he says how it is very interesting to note the way the words of the sages are characterized by the Mishnah in Pirkei Avot. Specifically, chapter 2, Mishnah 15, or for me, it's Mishnah 11. There are different girsas. And it says like this, V'kol divrehem kegach ha'leish, and all their words are like coals of fire. So Rav Bernstein quotes the Ramchal, and he says the Ramchal takes note of the fact that it's very interesting that the Mishnah does not characterize the statements of Chazal like fire. Their words are like fire. It says they're like coals of fire. Why does it compare their words to coals of fire instead of to fire itself? So says the Ramchal, that's because a person who looks at a piece of coal it looks like a regular piece of gray rock, nothing particularly exceptional about it. However, if you move the coals around, you work with the coals, you stoke it, you fan it, you'll effectively have it roaring into a flame. And so that, says Ramchal, is a proper analogy to the words of the Chachamim. A person could look at a Mishnah Pirkei Avot and be like, that seems like some nice advice, and then move on with their day. However, the more you work with it, the more you try to glean from it, the more you turn it around. Why did they use this word and not that word? Why did they put make this analogy as opposed to a different analogy? Why did they compare these two things together? They don't seem to be appropriately compared. So in that way, you can really start to take more out of what the Chachamim are saying. And that's why the Ramchal says the Mishnah characterizes the words of the Chachamim like coals of fire. If, like coals, you don't turn around, it'll just look like a great piece of rock. However, if you really work with it, you'll get a roaring flame out of it. And that's Rav Bernstein. Rav Aharon Feldman actually continues to elaborate on this terse wording of the Chachamim when it comes to words of wisdom. Now, why does he say this? Because again, last week we spoke about the Mishnah. The Mishnah generally is a brief overview of all of halacha, of all of Jewish law. However, it's not all like that. There are sections which speak about Agartha statements, right? They're Jewish philosophy, if you will. There's Jewish wisdom. There's ethics and morals that are imbued into here. And now, what's important to realize is the oral law was at one time oral. It was not written down, and so the Chachamim had to figure out, how do we put this into writing in a way that will preserve its character? So that's a much more straightforward. That's much more straightforward for law. Law is law. You figure it out. They'll put the general principles, and now you can go through the specifics through reasoning, through understanding the principles of legal exegesis. When it comes to wisdom, that's much more difficult, because on the one hand, they need to code them so that wise students will get it, but they had to hide this that the dilettantes would not get it. Or in the way that Rav Aharon Feldman says is, wise students would be shown the way to divine the true meaning behind the parables, while the inept would take them for nothing more than charming tales or shrewd advice. And shrewd advice is probably much more appropriate to the Agartha and Pirkei Avot. And therefore, it had to be kind of put down in a way that you could understand the basic meaning, but to get the deeper meaning would take much more work. As we said, stoking the coals. Now, even though that it's true that some Agartha statements are esoteric, there are some that are much more straightforward, right? They're like this. She says, there are many examples of Agartha where ideas which could be successfully conveyed in ordinary language are nonetheless delivered in an oblique manner. So, for example, says Rav Aharon Feldman, the Talmud advises a person whose father owns a supply of figs to sell them as soon as a market opens up for them and not wait for his father to sell them. And so he quotes the Vilna Gaon, who explains that this is an admonishment to scholars to teach their wisdom to the public, even when still in the learning stage himself, a son, and dependent upon his teacher, the father, should teach whatever wisdom he knows, the supply of figs, to anyone who desires to learn from him when the market opens up. He should not relegate this obligation to his teacher. Now, it is very interesting, like, why does the Torah, at the end of the day, this isn't some crazy deep wisdom. Why can't you just say, okay, so just a scholar should teach towards the public? Well, there you go. So why don't they just say that? So says Rav Aaron Feldman, that's because he makes a number of points. We can't go through all of them, but because I'll quote two. First, is to teach students that wisdom is acquired only by those willing to expend the effort. A person who doesn't really want to expend the effort and is kind of lazy and doesn't feel like really going through it and going through all the nuances of the text, they won't glean the full wisdom of the text. And therefore, if Chazal had just kind of made the point itself, then even lazy people could just read and be like, cool, I got it, I have all the wisdom necessary. However, it's only the Chacham people who really try to sit down and glean, like, what does this mean? What's this whole verse with figs and selling it? Like, who cares? The Talmud is teaching us about commerce. And so specifically the purpose of gaining wisdom is to carry it out into action. People who will not exert themselves to understand wisdom do not appreciate its value and certainly will not trouble themselves to live by it. That's the lashon of Rav Aaron Feldman. And therefore, it's better that people who will not trouble themselves to live by it never come to understand it to begin with. It's to keep the ignorant away from these messages. And in fact, since we're already in Rambam with Pirkei Avot, Rav Aaron Feldman quotes Rambam, and he says, Agartha was kept obscure, and now we're quoting Rambam, to sharpen the students' minds and to inspire their hearts, and also to blind the eyes of those fools who do not restrain the desires of their hearts, and who, if the full force of the truth were revealed to them, would reject it because of their character deficiencies. So that's one reason why these wise sayings were hidden in metaphorical languages, or as stories, shrewd advice, etc. And then the second point I want to bring out is because the Chazal were able to add overtones to each one of their statements. For example, if they just said a Torah scholar should teach his wisdom to the public, well, that's all you get. However, by teaching the son and his father and the marketplace, here's the extra things you get. First, it teaches a Rebbe, a teacher, the appropriate relationship he should have with his students. His students are like his children; they're like his sons. That's a very powerful point to make to a person who's a teacher. These people aren't just often like the relationship between a professor and a student. Like, look, you're just paying the tuition, which pays my salary, and that's all I really care about you. Just make sure you pass, and that's all I care. No, you're supposed to develop a relationship with your students. These people are supposed to be people you care about. You care about their success, and not only in their learning, but in all manner of things. So that's one. But moreover, the fact that it's compared to a marketplace. Now, the reason why that's so interesting is because the Chazal are trying to allude to the fact that Torah learning is a purchase. Just like a person who, say, wants to become a stockbroker or a lawyer. What does that take? You can't just go in trading stocks. A person who just decides to dip some money into the market is probably going to lose. It's going to cost him a lot because he doesn't really know what he's doing. He hasn't done the research. He has no idea how the market operates. So too, a person who wants to engage in law without going through law school, without going through 3 years of schooling, with all the tuition and all the energy and all the effort and all the difficulties that entails, they're going to make mistakes if they try to be like, oh, I can interpret the statute super easy. Let me just do it like this. And then he'll mess it up and he'll lose his case. So to a person who really wants to acquire wisdom, you need to put in effort and energy and money, and it's an acquisition. It's like the market. You want to invest in the market, then learn the market, understand what's going on, and invest the effort, and you might need to pay for classes and go through all that work. So too, when a person wants to understand wisdom, they need to be able to glean through it. They need to put effort into it. They need to hire a teacher. They need to pay for Torah classes. They need to maybe fly certain places to meet people in order to learn from them. These are all some of the messages that come through the hidden language of the sages, and this is part of what Rambam is alluding to in his introduction to Pirkei Avot. We'll end there.